I think the main way that I support my clients with ADHD is possibly not much different from other conditions. And it's really to attune with them and provide them with a sense of safety, a co-creation of safety where they can feel all that they have suppressed. So just allowing gradually in their own time the emotion to be felt and expressed and held. And that does so much. That has been my journey as well. I've gone really, really deep doing my own work. Is the more that emotion has come up, the more I've been able to express it in regulation with my compassionate inquiry practitioner, the more regulated I've become as a person. And I've added meditation in now. And for some people with ADHD, that sounds impossible. You know, I used to be one of those people, like, I can't meditate. No, can't do it. Like, I didn't even want to think about it. It felt kind of yucky, the thought of having to sit still. Or for clients of mine that feel that way, I gently just, if they are receptive and want ideas, we talk about what is it that does feel good? How can you regulate yourself? Not everyone wants to sit and meditate. When I could was when I realised I wanted to. I was taking cues from my body and not trying to do it all in one go. And only then did I start to feel ready for meditation. And knowing that the work is probably lifelong and ongoing. There is no end point.
This is the Gifts of Trauma podcast. Stories of transformation and healing through compassionate inquiry. Welcome, Nancy, to the Gifts of Trauma podcast. I'm so glad that you could join me today to talk about ADHD, its gifts, and how it can impact the lives of children and adults. And I'm hoping you can also share some stories that illustrate how we can support our own ADHD and that of those we love.
Thanks, Rosemary.
All right, Nancy, I know you're a compassionate inquiry practitioner and that you co-lead the Compassionate Inquiry ADHD focus group, which I have attended as I also experience ADHD. You're a meditation teacher, a life and addiction coach, a wife, and a mother. You've also learned how to support your own ADHD and addiction recovery. The most common online question is, what is ADHD?
Mm-hmm.
Now, given the work that you do, this may be a question that you're often asked. So I'm just wondering, would you like to address it?
Yeah, I can have a go. I would say, it's a group of symptoms. In my mind, all the people in my family with ADHD are also highly sensitive. I think that will align with Gabor Maté's teachings and other opinions. And it is definitely exacerbated by the trauma of unmet childhood needs. And it can include hyperactivity, impulsivity, distractedness, zoning out. And it's definitely not a deficit of attention, in my opinion. It is all of the attention and all of the things at all of the same time. Quite often, many of us will recognize that we start doing one task and we bounce around to all the other tasks that are also being held in our minds.
Great description. I think of it when it occurs to me, especially my thoughts get very busy. My thoughts go a little wild, and it's almost the visual I think of is colliding thought bubbles. If I was a cartoon character, I would not have one thought bubble per cell of comic. I would have like a whole bunch of them fighting for my attention. So I guess it shows up a little bit differently for everybody, but there's always a lot shows up at the same time. Might be a common denominator.
Yeah, definitely. And it does, it does cross over with anxiety, depression, dyslexia, OCD. These things can all be interlinked, and autism spectrum disorder. And so it's wildly varying depending on the individual.
So what you're saying really, if I recap with different words, is that, it all falls into the neurodiversity spectrum. And it seems to get a lot of attention, ADHD. And so I'm wondering, I have two questions, which I will separate. I will take those two thought bubbles and pull them apart. We used to have ADD and ADHD, and now it's all being combined. And I had a conversation with someone just last week, and they said, no, I definitely have ADD, not ADHD, because I'm not hyperactive. I wonder how you would have responded to that comment from her.
I would be curious about what it's like inside her mind, because my hyperactivity definitely was very internal. So I think it's still there. I don't sort of physically, I have one of my sons is very physically hyperactive, and goes out and walks around the block a few times a day, even with his headphones on. But mine is all internal, but I still consider it hyperactivity.
That's exactly what I said to her because my mind can race sometimes. And it's not the most pleasant thought, especially when I'm trying to focus and I've got all these other thoughts passing through my mind. It would be almost like the literal equivalent of, you know, pulling out your laptop at a train station and trying to focus while trains are coming in and out and people are passing by. It makes it a little bit difficult or a lot difficult, depending on what the distractions are. So yeah, that's very well said. Thank you. We're going to run through a few facts before we get into some meaty stories. Something
Yeah.
else I found in my research is that ADHD, it's growing rapidly, both in public awareness and rate of diagnosis. So as of mid 2024, adult ADHD ranks in the top 10 mental health searches on Google. So that's I think is quite significant. And as of a couple of years ago, 2022, the hashtag ADHD had 11.4 billion views on TikTok. Now, here's where I'm hoping this conversation will come in. That source went on to cite that many people credit these platforms, such as TikTok and social media, with helping them realize they've had the diagnosis and subsequently seeking treatment. But they also pointed out that misinformation is rampant on social media channels. But they said that same study showed that the content posted by healthcare providers and professionals was overwhelmingly more useful and accurate. So I'm hoping that we can fall into the useful and accurate category. And something else I found, British statistics, the number of adults receiving an NHS, National Health Service prescription for ADHD increased sevenfold from 2013 to 2023, which 10-year period. And new figures from Public Health Scotland show that in 2023, almost as many adults as children were being treated for ADHD. So do you have any thoughts on it was thought for so long primarily as something that affected children, and now the adults are showing up. So how does that land for you? What do you make that mean?
Yeah, definitely resonates with me, because I always knew that my brain worked differently, and that's all I kind of understood growing up, and it was pushed away. And when my son chose to have a diagnosis at 14 because he wants to access college and felt that it might be helpful, particularly for sitting exams and getting extra time and that kind of thing, his diagnosis came back, and I thought, right, okay, that's probably me as well. Briefly into my story, I stopped drinking alcohol when I was 46, and I thought that would be the answer to my chaotic mind, and it wasn't. Surprise, surprise. So a year later, I thought, okay, let's find out. Let's get a diagnosis, and it came back. And with a lot of the people I work with, mainly women, they've found the same thing. So they've stopped their drinking of alcohol, which was their self-medication, really, a lot like me. And the problems are still there, but more obvious because they're not being masked anymore.
Yes.
So either the children are getting diagnosed and then they're realizing the similarities and getting diagnosed themselves, or giving up of an addiction is showing that there is still underlying symptoms.
I think if I'd been in your position, I would have been tempted to compare my own diagnosis with my son's and see if there were similarities there. Was that a temptation for you?
It didn't really occur to me. We were diagnosed quite differently as well. He went through a different channel to me. So it sounds mean, but my husband kind of laughs at me and my eldest son because we are so similar with things like forgetfulness and messiness. And I believe my husband also has ADHD, but is also on the spectrum. So he's really about timings, plans, schedules, control. We kind of, our family balances each other out.
Yeah, and as you were saying that, I was wondering, I've always been like, my mom was very controlling, and I always like to be places on time, if not early. I'm rather obsessively tidy. When I was going through my house flipping phase, it wasn't a problem at all for me to live in a show home because that's normally how my house looks, because it makes me happy to put everything in its place. But I have a sneaking suspicion that might be some kind of coping strategy. And it was interesting you were speaking about alcohol because the thing that really exposed my ADHD to me, and I have not been formally diagnosed, was when I developed this brief love affair with coffee. And as someone with ADHD, I'm very sensitive to caffeine. So it was kind of fun to have a cup of coffee and turn into a squirrel. You know, if you can just picture a squirrel, especially if they think that if they're, being vigilant and they think there might be a predator around and their head goes this way, and they're looking up and down and sideways. That's how I felt on coffee. I don't know, there was something about the caffeine that also made me feel a little bit like I had superpowers, and it wasn't until I was in the presence of my daughter, and she said, "Mom," like, it was dysregulating her to watch me do my squirrel impersonation, and we were actually packing up a friend's house, and I was going here and there and putting things down and forgetting where I'd put them. I was a squirrel losing her nuts. And I realized the impact that, indulging my ADHD to that extent could have on someone else. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit. I've fairly recently, been in the company with a few people who have ADHD, and for the first time in my life, I found it quite dysregulating for me to be around their ADHD. So I'm wondering, maybe you can share a story or two about what it's like for you on the inside and what it's like for you to be in the environment of someone else with ADHD. And you could pick either thread that appeals to you.
So the one thing that can happen for me with clients with ADHD that talk, the real talkers talk very quickly, is that I can get caught up with them and their story and get pulled out of my groundedness. So for me, it is so important to have my own practice, staying grounded, knowing how to regulate myself in a session with a client. And also in the early days when I was going through the mentorship, is learning how to have the confidence to interrupt and ask somebody to slow down. And so that's the one way it's really noticeable for me. And I can myself be very excitable, not in my client sessions, but in day-to-day life. And when I'm with other people of a similar ilk, yeah, the excitement and it's fun, it's fun and lively and bubbly and energetic. But for me, that I have a short window of tolerance. of being around that kind of energy. And I come away feeling extremely depleted and have to just be on my own and regulate again. And so it can be fun and draining.
I would agree, and that's kind of a fairly recent realization. It's when someone shows up pumping energy, if it's not energy that you can you can jump on board with and enjoy the ride, it can be quite exhausting.
Hmm. And I do also notice in groups, so I'm much better on one-to-one. If I'm in a group and there are loud, energetic people in the group, I withdraw and I hold back. And that's something I've done all my life, as far as I can remember. Groups have always been difficult for me. And even on Zoom, when I first started the training with compassionate inquiry, I really struggled showing up in a group. I mean, this is something we might go on to, but that's something I've really overcome. I mean, as you mentioned, I'm co-hosting the focus group and in other various environments. In person, there's probably still some work to do, especially socially.
It's interesting that you say that because I have the opposite problem. If the conversation is too slow, it's as if my mind gets bored and starts thinking about other things. And I have a very hard time not working with clients one on one for whatever reason I'm grateful for. That can go at whatever pace. But if I'm in conversation with someone else or watching a video, watching a training, and they speak slowly, I just do my best to stay present and kind of like in meditation, bring the puppy back, bring the puppy back. I try to practice that, but it's very, very challenging.
Mm. Yeah. I was at a small garden party recently, and there were two lovely ladies sitting next to me having a conversation. And I was with them, but I wasn't talking. And I hadn't realized that I'd completely zoned out. I don't know what my face was doing, but one of them turned around to me and said, "Oh, Nancy, I'd really love to know what you're thinking." And then the other girl said, "Yeah, me too." And I just was like, "God, how do I like say that I'm zoned out?" And that's the first time I'd met them both as well. So I was quite embarrassed about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my goodness, I can imagine. It's interesting how opposite our responses can be. And I think that's probably part of the complexity of this whole condition. So I had an interesting story to share where I was actually collaborating with someone on a project, and we were speaking a lot digitally. We weren't face to face for much. And she was getting really angry with me. Like it was a very highly detailed project, and she was getting angry with me. I told you this,
Mhm.
and it was all verbal. And I don't retain verbal. Like I'm a visual learner. So if you send me an email, it'll be locked and loaded. But if I'm listening to something, if I'm not taking really good notes or, I can forget it. So she thought I was just I just didn't care. I was being distracted.
Mm.
So one day we met in person and we went over a lot of details. And then we got on the phone later and she asked me a question about something that we discussed that morning. And it's like, I know we talked about it, but I can't remember what we decided. And it was like a revelation for her. She said, I thought you just weren't paying attention, but we sat across the table from each other and I watched you and you were paying attention. Why can't you remember this detail? And it's like, welcome to my world. I have all these little hacks. I'll record voice notes. I will highlight written things. Like I'm sure everybody who's dealt with ADHD for a while has various hacks when they need to remember things. But I was very glad she did that. I didn't realize I'd been tested until she said that. But, because I'm also highly sensitive, I could sense her annoyance. And I kind of guessed it was because I wasn't remembering everything, but I did not realize she thought I just wasn't taking the project seriously.
Mm.
So it's very interesting to help someone else discover what life is like on this side. So
Yeah. Yeah, that resonates.
Yeah. So I guess it makes sense, given what we've just discussed, that the second most frequently searched term on Google is what causes ADHD? And if I may, I'm going to start this off by sharing a few of the many working theories I found in my research, and then I'll pass it over to you, Nancy. Now, these theories range from nutritional toxicity to a desire for instant gratification, a loss of societal structure, a neurodevelopmental disorder, low levels of dopamine, the interaction of several genes, abnormalities related to frontal subcortical function that directly impact a person's executive function, and memory consolidation. On the other hand, Dr. Gabor Maté, author of Scattered Minds, whose therapeutic approach has been made teachable in the compassionate inquiry training process, which Nancy and I have both been through, he has a specific and really confident perspective on ADHD that differs significantly from anything I just mentioned and lands really solidly with me. So,
Mhm.
just to summarize, rather than viewing ADHD as a genetic or medical disorder, Gabor proposes that ADHD is a developmental issue influenced by adaptive responses to childhood stress and trauma. Now, after listening to that laundry list of theories, how do they land with you?
Well, as soon as I read Gabor's book, Scattered Minds, it landed so solidly. It was like unquestionable. That felt like my truth. And he does also say that everyone with ADHD will have the group of genes for sensitivity, but not everybody who is highly sensitive will have ADHD.
Great.
And looking through my family lineage, my family of origin, my dad was a highly sensitive musician and alcoholic, really. He was absent in my life, but the times I remember watching him play, he used to play double bass, jazz. I could the emotion on his face, and he was a man that never expressed any emotion. You know, he would play with his eyes closed, and I just knew. Sometimes I would see him with tears, big tears in the backs of his eyes. So there's definitely the sensitivity genes in my family. And historically, my dad's, was a young child in World War II and was evacuated, lived away from his family, grew up in poverty. So there was trauma there, probably more than I'm aware of. And for my mum as well, I believe she possibly had ADHD. She was anxious, depressed, dysregulated, self-medicated for some of my childhood, was erratic with her emotional availability. And very often she wasn't emotionally available. And certainly my emotions were not well tolerated unless I was happy and smiling. So, what really resonated for me was that the early attunement that I would have needed was not there.
Mhm.
It just wasn't there. And my mum did her absolute best. And I know how much she loved me, and I know how hard she worked and how much she tried to meet my needs, but she just wasn't able to. And yeah, I can feel the emotion. I mean, I've done lots of work on this, but it's still,
Let's pause for a moment, Nancy. Just that emotion arise. Can see it
yeah,
on your face. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. And it's hard. Even though I was adopted as an infant and I don't have biological history, how you've described your mom could easily describe my mom as well.
yeah,
Both my parents being British, emotions really were not welcome. And whenever I voiced an emotion, it's like, oh, you don't have to say it. Don't let that thing out.
yeah.
Just be cool. Just keep it inside like we are. Stiff upper lip.
yeah, I remember often being told, "Don't be so ridiculous. Stop making a fuss." And for a child who's highly sensitive, the shame that arose from those kind of comments. And so I just pushed it all, kept it all inside, pushed it all down, and smiled and learned to look calm and relaxed and happy. And it's no surprise that alcohol became a way just to dampen it all down.
Yeah, definitely.
And I can share all that about my mum, and there's absolutely no blame. I have nothing but love and compassion, despite sometimes her harshness and her disapproval and ways that she showed up. But there's nothing but love, because I know it's nothing she did intentionally. And that's what sometimes people struggle with, clients struggle with when we start going into the early childhood stuff. They don't want to feel like they're criticizing their parents.
Fair enough. Yes, absolutely. We're very resistant to that, which is also something that goes back to childhood. We want to believe
Yeah.
that we had a happy childhood and that everything was as it should have been, and sometimes it wasn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I sort of now I can see how, because of my early childhood, I wasn't able to be present for my two eldest children in the way that they needed me. And I've come to terms with that. There was a lot of guilt at first, but I absolutely know I did the best I could. But I was stressed, dysregulated, lacked support, community, family support. My sister, her children were older, but she was still busy with her family. I had a little bit of help from my mum, but that was a struggle because she parented the old fashioned way, put him in the pram in the garden to cry, he'll soon get over it, which I was like not having any of.
Yeah.
So I kind of was alone a lot of the time with two children that were 21 months apart. And I know that I wasn't all that they needed. So it all rings true, the way that Gabor describes the roots of ADHD in scattered minds.
I agree. It landed the same way for me. And I'm going to share a quote from one of Gabor's lecture videos that I've also referenced in the show notes, because I think this captures it beautifully in less words than the whole book. He says, if we recognize that most of the problems that people are troubled with are actually problems of development, and it's those developmental conditions that we need to look at, we'll be asking ourselves, what are the conditions in the society that lead so many people to have a failure of or slowing down of the impulse regulation circuitry and capacity? That's the first point. So it's a developmental problem rather than a medical problem per se. Number two, if you look at the term ADHD, why do we have this capacity to tune out? Protection from overwhelming stress is his conclusion. And he goes on to say, if I were to stress you right now by becoming abusive or threatening, what options would you have? And he's speaking to an audience. The options are standing up and telling me to shut up. You also have the option of leaving. So you have the options of fight or flight. And if you couldn't do either, you would also have the option, given that there are many dozens of people here in the room with you, you have the option of asking for help. But what if I were to stress one of you and you didn't have the option to ask for help or escape or to fight back? Then what would you do? You wouldn't do anything, and so freezing is your option. Tuning out is another. Just going absent-minded, dissociating so you wouldn't have to feel the pain of the stress. Can you see I might have lots of reasons to tune out as a 1-year-old, as a 2-month-old, or 3-year-old? So maybe ADHD begins as a coping mechanism. That made a lot of sense to me. because I was shamed often. And back to what you said about your mom taking care of your children, my daughter was their first grandchild. And I was happy for her to visit them until I noticed they were using the shaming techniques on her that they'd used on me. And that was not okay. I caught it early. She was just being confused. She wasn't, going into shame or anything. And of course, why wouldn't they? They were just doing the best they could with her as they did with me. So I'm going to add one other little quote that I think really supports this well. What I just shared to support the developmental nature of ADHD, Gabor invites us to imagine being a gardener. And he says, if your plants are not developing the way you expect them to, the first thing you would look at are the conditions: too much or too little sunlight, too much or not enough irrigation or rain. How about the quality of the soil? You look at the conditions of development, and if you want those plants to develop properly, you would fix those conditions. You wouldn't try to treat the plants for some kind of disease. Most of the time, you'd be looking at the conditions for development. And again, that just made so much sense to me.
Absolutely. And what sometimes frustrates me when I try and listen to other podcasts and other people talking about ADHD, I heard someone say recently she's a popular TikToker who has ADHD, but there wasn't any trauma in my life without the understanding that it's so early that there might not be a memory. The brain is developing from in utero up until age 3. And that's when it's being wired. And that's when the dopamine receptors and all of those technical things that I don't quite know about, our serotonin levels and dopamine levels in relation to our environment.
And it could be our family pattern, our family role. We don't see those things. We don't necessarily question them. And in order to maintain our attachment, we shift our perception to make whatever happened to us okay, whether it was getting spanked or worse. That's just how it was in our family. And we were all happy.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that for me is the missing piece out of the mainstream view of ADHD, is that people are still not understanding unless they've watched Gabor and followed his work.
Well, I'd like to add a little bit of ADHD history to I think this explains the confusion really well, because it's been over 200 years now that ADHD has been described and re-described, which I think plays into why there's so many different disparate theories about what causes it and opinions on it. I was surprised to learn that Sir Alexander Crichton wrote one of the earliest documented clinical descriptions of a disorder in 1798 book on attention and its diseases. So what he described there looks very much like what we see as ADHD today. And then in the early 1900s, British physician Sir George Frederick Still described a number of children with a deficit of moral control, which identified a number of features that we typically see in ADHD today. And when it first appeared in 1968 in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, called the DSM, the focus was on overactivity and distractibility. Now, subsequent DSM editions shifted the defining feature to attention deficit. In 1980, the DSM limited the number of symptoms of attention deficit disorder, or ADD. And then, in 1987, the DSM combined inattention and hyperactivity into one diagnosis. The next DSM divided the diagnosis into 3 subtypes. 2013's DSM reversed that trend and broadened the definition of ADHD significantly, allowing for autism spectrum disorder, ASD, and ADHD to coexist, which contributed somewhat to the rise in ADHD prevalence as it added this huge group of children who were previously excluded. So these changing criteria, they make clinical diagnosis really difficult. And in the absence of biomarkers, it's diagnosed by signs and symptoms. You said yourself, your diagnosis approach and your son's were completely different. So it leaves a lot to clinical interpretation and can lead to over and under diagnosis. So I think all that confusion from the regulatory body that diagnoses mental conditions is like, this is just part of the whole chaotic picture of ADHD. So I'm wondering, we've talked about the rise in ADHD and awareness and diagnosis. What's your perspective on the growth of ADHD?
When I think about my own experience and how we parent these days, so often in isolation, so often stressed, I was fortunate that I wasn't also trying to work, but there are parents who are having to go out to work and put babies into nursery full time. And I cannot imagine what that is doing to generations of highly sensitive children. How stressful. And this isn't to blame parents at all, because quite often there is no choice. There is no good choice. So for me, that must play, to my mind. I mean, my experience just in having to manage two young children, also with ADHD myself, not having the tools to regulate myself, zoning out when they needed me, and families being dispersed, so not having aunts and uncles and grandparents, not having a village. I think that contributes. And you've mentioned some of the other things. Obviously, there is a lot more awareness now. So people are recognizing what may before have been passed off as something else or ignored. But it goes back to the toxic culture, I believe, that Gabor talks about in his most recent book.
Yeah, absolutely. And in last week's interview, Sataram spoke about it too, about the cultural of the capitalistic culture, where so much gets sacrificed in order to make a living. And in a couple of weeks, I'll be speaking to Dr. Gordon Neufeld, and we know for a fact he and Gabor worked together on the book Hold On to Your Kids, and the whole shift in attachment orientation from parents to peers. That's another very disturbing cultural trend that we're seeing now. Just as you mentioned, people having to take their kids to full-time daycare and go off to work. That's all supporting these cultural shifts. And we humans are not doing well as a result.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah. We've danced around this a little bit, the ADHD focus group that you co-lead. I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit, perhaps share the sorts of questions and stories people bring to that group, of course, protecting their privacy. But are there typical questions? Is there such a thing, or are they all as diverse as the nature of this condition?
It is very diverse, and what we've seen, it's been about a year and a half now since we've held that focus group, is that the benefit to that group is being with other people that get it and get you and understand, people that can share things that they haven't shared before, and have someone say, yeah, me too. So it's all kinds of things. And of course, my mind has gone a little bit blank now as to recent questions and topics. But the common theme is people just feeling held and supported by other people that really get it. And it's the non-judgment and the acceptance. If there's ever a bit of a rift or a misunderstanding, just yesterday, a few of us got together on Zoom where we could see each other's faces to just say, each person said their piece, and we're like, yeah, it's all good. We get it. we get triggered. So triggers, I think, might be the topic for this upcoming session, and how we deal with those.
It makes sense because I think just our conversation together has demonstrated how differently this condition can show up in different people. So I noticed on your compassionate inquiry practitioner profile, which I've included in the show notes, that you specialize in working with people experiencing addiction and ADHD. What can you share with us about the work that you do that might be helpful for listeners who perhaps wonder if they or their partners, their children, or colleagues are experiencing ADHD behaviors?
I think the main way that I support my clients with ADHD is possibly not much different from other conditions. And it's really to attune with them and provide them with a sense of safety, a co-creation of safety where they can feel all that they have suppressed. So just allowing gradually in their own time the emotion to be felt and expressed and held. And that does so much. It really does. And that has been my journey as well. I've gone really, really deep doing my own work. Is the more that that emotion has come up, the more I've been able to express it in regulation with my compassionate inquiry practitioner, the more regulated I've become as a person. And I've added meditation in now, only for a year. And for some people with ADHD, that sounds impossible. You know, I used to be one of those people, like, I can't meditate. No, can't do it. Like, I didn't even want to think about it. It felt kind of yucky, the thought of having to sit still. Or for clients of mine that feel that way, I gently just, if they are receptive and want ideas, we talk about walking, dancing. And what is it that does feel good? How can you regulate yourself? Not everyone wants to sit and meditate. When I could was when I realized I wanted to. I started to feel like I really want to do that now. But that came after. So when I first stopped drinking alcohol, I went kind of not crazy in the gym, but I went to the gym and had a personal trainer. And for a whole year, it was about physical exercise. And I did a lot of walking in nature. And then after that, something happened. I was taking cues from my body, and I suddenly went into, this doesn't feel nourishing. I need to feel nourished. And I started doing yoga. And I was doing yoga probably for a couple of years, 3 times a week. And only then did I start to feel ready for meditation. Because at the end of the yoga class, we would do a little bit, and I would notice sitting or lying down, the tears would just start rolling when I got into that still place. And this was kind of in conjunction with a lot of grief that was coming up at the time, and doing my own work with my practitioner. So, yeah, having a safe place to explore and express suppressed emotions, and some kind of regulating practice for the nervous system, and fun, finding ways to, alongside this journey that can go very deep, is to keep bobbing up. You know, I have had this a metaphor of deep diving and then popping back up for air and getting some sunshine on your face, and then diving back down again, and then coming back up, and not trying to do it all in one go. And knowing that the work is probably lifelong and ongoing. There is no end point.
Well, I think it's amazing that you have got to the depth you have with meditation. And I love what you just said about diving deep. As a little kid, I used to love going into a swimming pool, diving to the bottom, hanging there for a bit, and then in the deep end, pushing my feet as hard as I could against the concrete and like popping up and then going down again. And in a way, if you think of yoga practice and meditation, that could be considered, part of that practice. But it was just I love the silence down there, and then I love the rush and the burst out into sunlight as well. So thank you for bringing that back. I haven't thought about that for a very long time.
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, like finding ways to play, rest, obviously nutrition and hydration and regulation. So whatever that is for the individual, and it will be different for everyone. Dancing is a big one for me, whether that's in my kitchen or going to an ecstatic. I can't do late night dancing anymore, so clubs are out the window, but I used to enjoy that.
Beautiful. Now, Nancy, we're sort of coming towards the end of our time together. I'm curious about how you found compassionate inquiry. You said you read the book Scattered Minds. So, if you could share how you found compassionate inquiry, what sort of a difference it's made in your life?
Wow, big question. I found compassionate inquiry when I was doing an addictive behaviors coaching course, and someone shared one of Gabor's videos. And it resonated so deeply that it became my, new special interest. And I watched every YouTube clip I could find, listened to podcasts, found his book on addiction in the realm of hungry ghosts, then Scattered Minds, then When the Body Says No, which I bought all of, but listened to on Audible because I can't just do one or the other. I can't read a physical book. And if I only have it on Audible, then I miss bits. I want to underline and fold corners down. And then I just thought, I need more. I need to learn. Is he doing a course? Is he doing a training? And got so excited when I discovered that there was this training, Compassionate Inquiry. And when I found it, my my dad had passed away quite suddenly. It was in the November and I was in the February 22 cohort. So I decided to do the training before my dad passed away, which happened in like a 2-week span from realizing he was ill to his passing. And he lived in another country and it was during COVID. So all of a sudden I was just filled with grief. And I said to my husband, I I don't think I can do it. I think I need to pull out. And he just said, "No, you need to do it. You should do it. I'm here. I'll support you." Yeah, and the emotion is coming again, just remembering how difficult it was to have all of that grief and have to explore it every week in the dyads and triads or just have to show up. But it was life-changing, absolutely life-changing. And straight away, I switched from the therapist. I'd only started doing personal therapy in the August before, but as soon as I started the training, I switched to compassionate inquiry practitioner, who I still work with. And it has completely changed. It's been transformative. It's changed my relationship with all of my children. It's potentially saved my marriage. Um, and despite the rocky start that my children had with me, I've been working on my relationship with them since they were kind of 6 and 8 and trying to do better. And this has just really deepened my connection with them as well.
Yeah.
And knowing how to show up for them and come alongside them and love and accept them exactly as they are and trust in their capacity to heal. Because they have ADHD, one of them is highly anxious, one of them is very highly sensitive. And I just trust now that they can do the work if they need to. And they have already at times asked me for support and asked me to recommend a therapist. And my eldest 2 sons are 18 and 20. So they've dipped in and back out. So the main thing for me, it's given me trust in myself and in others' capacity to heal.
Thank you so much. I wish our listeners could see your face and just see all of the emotion that was moving through your body as you shared that. Thank you. You have linked ADHD and sensitivity.
Hmm.
Is there a connection between ADHD and addiction? You kind of alluded to it with, the alcohol would calm you down and help you regulate, but is that it, or is there more?
I think people will find ways to self-medicate, whether it's with caffeine or alcohol or running. We find ways, and it's very common in my experience. The majority of my clients are in recovery from alcohol misuse or alcohol addiction. I mean, I don't use the term alcoholic. I didn't come through like the AA route of recovery. Yeah, but substance use disorder. And I see it. I've seen patterns in my family members. It might be food, might be nicotine. Vaping is quite a common thing with teenagers these days that have ADHD. So it's just that they're trying to find that balance with cannabis as well. And for some people, it does really work. For me, alcohol really worked until it didn't, until it was causing me more problems. Um, it worked up until a point, and thankfully, and I think being a mum and having a caring role, I just was always trying to manage it. I was always trying so hard to moderate. And it just got to the point where it was consuming me. And one day I thought, I just want to know what it feels like to be sober, to be an adult that doesn't drink alcohol. I want that. I really wanted it. It was an internal, again, like a gut thing. So I said, I'm never going to drink again. I had to, because my husband and I were partners in crime. We met working in a pub together, 20 something, and we often encouraged each other. So I knew that if I was going to do it, I had to do it for me, and I had to tell him explicitly, never again, because it would just wheedle its way back in, and it would be one drink at the weekends, and your tolerance builds, and it creeps up and it creeps up and it creeps up. And that's a very familiar story with the people that I work with, people that I know. I have met people with ADHD that don't have substance use issues, but they might be workaholics.
Behavioral addictions. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fair enough. Thank you. Now, this is The Gifts of Trauma, which is a title that surprises many people because they don't think of gifts in trauma. So I was curious to ask you, what gifts have you realized through ADHD?
My sensitivity. Absolutely. I used to be embarrassed of my sensitivity. Like even saying it, the energy starts welling up again into my chest. But I appreciate it now. And it means that I can really attune to people that I work with. And because I can feel what they're feeling, it really guides me. And I notice, when I'm having an emotion, I can see you feeling it in the same way. And I felt extreme pain and extreme grief a couple of years ago. And I can remember saying to my practitioner, like, when will this ever end? I feel like the well of sadness is so deep, it's never going to stop. Um, but I went into it, I kept going and I kept going. And I one day just saw like equal parts joy and pain. I had this image of a heart on its side, and one half, the bottom half was black and the top half was red. And that for me is that the contrast of being able to feel pain so deeply. I can feel joy and happiness, and love in equal measure.
Mm, that's a beautiful visual. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I love the story of how you followed your internal cues. Like you just talked about following your gut, the journey from the gym to yoga practice to meditation. And I think our inner wiring, I know when I was in a actually life and death situation, my my gut just brought forth dissociation, and I was
Mhm.
able to survive because of that.
Yeah.
Deconstructing that afterwards took a little bit of work, but it was absolutely the most brilliant strategy, and I didn't even have to think about it, it just showed up. We really can trust our bodies to support us in ways that are helpful, and I love how, likewise, you take care of your body, you listen to the cues and you follow them. I don't think our bodies ask any more than that from us. Now,
Yeah.
I've asked you a lot of questions. I invite you to add in anything on this topic that I haven't asked you that you think our listeners would benefit from hearing.
The one thing that I haven't touched on, I mentioned that I've got two older sons that I didn't feel I showed up for in the way that they needed me to. I have a younger son, and when I had him, I was 40. And as any mother of multiple children knows, you learn from everyone, and they've been my greatest teachers. And with my youngest son, I moved away from my parents, where I grew up in London, where my mum was living, and decided that I'm going to do this my way and be the mum that I know I am at my core. And he shared our bed. I carried him everywhere. I met those needs of his. And he's highly sensitive, but he doesn't have behavioral things of ADHD. He's very empathic, sensitive, gentle, kind. My other two are all of those things as well. But I just, for me, it was when I found Gabor's work, I was just like, oh God, like I can see how I showed up differently and the impact it's had on my own children. And I just felt that was an important thing to share.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Last question.
Mhm.
What pearl of wisdom would you like to roll out for our listeners regarding ADHD? Maybe something that put you on a different path or something that you've learned since?
Yeah. One thing I found really helpful with my parenting was love the child that you have, not the one that you hope them to be. You know, come along by their side and just keep loving them. Gabor talks about it, keep biting your tongue. When you have a child with ADHD, just keep loving them exactly as they are and, keep building that bridge. And there is always hope. If your relationship is rough with your children, as long as you are in relationship with them, your relationship can grow and trust can build and it can flourish. And I have two adult children now who just spent 2 weeks on holiday with us and love being around us. And for me, that's such a gift and an honor that my kids still want to be around me.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I can see the emotion as you bring that up. And that's a big deal. That's a big deal that your adult kids or adult ish kids
Yeah.
still want to spend time with mom and dad.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, thank you so much, Nancy, for being with us today.
Yeah, it's so lovely to chat and a real honor to be present and representing all us ADHDers. And I just want to, yeah, also shout out to my co-hosts on the focus group, Monica and Vera, because we're a team, and welcome anyone else in the compassionate inquiry community that might want to be part of that.
Excellent. I will put a link to the focus group in the show notes. I think a lot of people will be leaving this podcast feeling hopeful, curious, and perhaps get busy tracking down the patterns that they see and exploring. There are lots of resources in the show notes. Please check them out. There's books and video lectures, all kinds of things. So they're there for you. And yes, enjoy the journey. Thank you, Nancy.
Thanks, Rosemary.
If you've been listening to our podcast and are curious about the transformative power of compassionate inquiry, you are invited to join us on Saturday, February 22nd, for a 6-hour online experiential introduction to the compassionate inquiry approach and community. Whether you're a healthcare professional, therapist, coach, or simply someone seeking trauma-informed personal healing or professional growth, the CI Experience event invites you to witness live demonstrations, learn practical techniques, participate in reflective conversations, and connect with a supportive community of like-minded individuals, all in a single immersive day. This event will be recorded, and as a participant, you'll have lifetime access to the event recording and so much more. The CI Experience takes place on February 22nd. To learn more and register, just follow the link in the show notes. The Gifts of Trauma is a weekly podcast that features personal stories of trauma healing, transformation, and the gifts revealed on the path to authenticity. Listen on Apple, Spotify, all podcast platforms. Rate, review, and share it with your clients, colleagues, and family. Subscribe and you won't miss an episode. Please note, this podcast is for informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for personal therapy or a DIY formula for self-therapy.